Howdy, my name is Kyle Holmberg, and here's the intro type slide thingy with all the relevant details about me, including a link to the rest of the slides so that you don't have to remember anything of what I'm about to show you. Before I dive in, I wanted to say that I work at air.inc. Myself and my coworkers are seeking to hire 3 other React developers, and we'll be working on a Next.js application. So hope to see you inside the Discord channel for the Air Labs job fair. I hope it's safe to say that we all love using Next.js, but perhaps you have coworkers that haven't heard of it or still aren't quite sold on the idea. If you're trying to sell somebody else on using Next.js, you'll want to be able to have a migration strategy so that they can begin to visualize the light at the end of the tunnel. This talk is aimed at giving you that strategy. I'm sure we've all got harrowing tales of jumping between technologies, but with the release of Next.js's optional catch-all routes, or their original catch-all routes, as well as Next.js rewrites, it's a relative breeze to make that migration. We did the conversion at air.inc, and you can too. Regardless of the application you're migrating from, there are a few steps I believe you can take inside your code base ahead of time to better prepare you for the migratory steps. First and foremost, you're going to want to remove any unsafe references to browser globals such as navigator, window, and document. You can do so by prefacing them with the type of operator, and make sure you only do so via that strategy, because attempting to do something like bang bang window will still yield a build error because Next.js is using universal JavaScript under strict mode. After you make window and other browser globals safe to use, you're going to want to move on to documenting any head code or meta tags inside of React Helmet, because once the migration does occur, you're going to want to move all of that into a custom underscore document component. After that, you're going to want to make note of any polyfills that Next.js doesn't support outside of the box. They have a page on the documentation regarding what those are. Lastly, you'll want to document all of the globally imported style sheets or scripts that you're referencing inside of your application, because once you do migrate to Next.js, those will need to be placed inside of a custom underscore app component. On we go to the actual strategies. Keep in mind that the main inspiration for this talk was because I floundered between all 3 of these strategies before settling on the final migratory path for air.inc. So I've got a good understanding of the pros and cons. The first strategy on my mind, and also my favorite, is to leverage Next.js rewrites to map paths to your old application URL that aren't currently covered in your Next.js application. This is awesome because you basically get to create a new application with create next app, define maybe one Next.js page, and the rest of your URLs will navigate to the previous deployment on a different host. There's no spooling down, there's no migratory work in the old code base, you just create a new one. Diving deeper into the pros and cons of this approach, I'm going to first list out the pros that I'm aware of. First and foremost, you get to ignore the pregame work because you're not making any changes to the old application, quote unquote old. Knowing that, I'd also consider it the fastest strategy you could be a part of, and Lee Robinson from the Vercel team actually has official documentation on converting Gatsby applications to Next.js. But one really cool thing about this approach is you can make that conversion step now a gradual process rather than a stop, convert everything to Next.js, and then resume feature development. The cons of this approach is that your developers are now split between 2 or more repositories. I say more only if you're already fractured. And if feature development, for example, does not stop, then another unfortunate side effect is that you're going to have your conversions now be moving targets. By that I mean if feature development doesn't stop during the migratory process, then you might get to a page, begin the conversion process, and then another developer might edit that page at the same time. The only other con that I'm aware of is that you're going to need to make sure all of your client-side routing links are relative paths. And if you have any relative paths that go to the Next.js application, they're going to need to be converted to not try to go to a route that exists in the client-side router so that it actually navigates the Next.js route. For us at Air, we dealt with this problem by just converting them to normal anchor tags, because the points where these existed, we were totally okay with it being a full page refresh. However, I'm certain there are better strategies. If you'd like to make sure that your developers stay in the same repository, or if you're just converting a portion of your application, for example, just your app, or just your marketing routes, or just your blog, then maybe using catch-all routes is an alternative. Looking at this code here, you can see that all we do is make sure that the component is mounted. Essentially, we're just waiting for the window to be available so that we don't server render or statically pre-render these routes. If you're unsure of what catch-all routes are or are unfamiliar with dynamic routing in Next.js, be sure to check out the documentation. Moving on to the pros and cons of this approach. I know it doesn't look like there are any pros. That doesn't mean it's a bad strategy. It just means that there's nothing to set it apart from the other two strategies. As cons, this does require pre-game tasks, unlike the first strategy. Additionally, you'll need to convert at least one page before deploying your Next.js application, which can be kind of like a holdup for feature development. And lastly, this strategy is only viable for Create React app migrants. Gatsby is not able to use this strategy, nor the next. The last strategy, leveraging optional catch-all routes, is essentially the previous strategy I described, but with one introductory step of leveraging optional catch-all routes. I'd like to note to you in this code that the only difference between the previous strategy is the file name. Namely, there's an extra pair of square brackets. If you're dead set on migrating your entire application in one go and are uncertain which page, if any, you'd like to convert to a Next.js page component, this strategy is a great one for you. You can render your entire Create React app, or equivalent application, within an optional catch-all route. Note that the moment you convert even one page, you'll want to rename the file back to being a normal catch-all route. In other words, get rid of a pair. So analyzing the pros and cons of this last approach, the awesome pro here is it's truly gradual. I still believe the second strategy is essentially pretty gradual, but the benefit here is you can convert as much or as little as you want while still leveraging the ecosystem of Next.js. Theoretically, you don't actually have to leverage the ability to statically pre-render or server render your React code. You can just keep it inside of an optional catch-all route forever and just simplify your configs, your polyfills, and your global imports. You also theoretically could never leverage Next.js's router or file structure-based routing mechanisms. If you're using React Router or Reach Router, there's nothing stopping you from continuing to do so inside of your catch-all or optional catch-all routes. As a con, you're still going to have to do the pre-game task just like you were in the second strategy, and just like the second strategy, this still is only viable to Create React app migrants and not to Gatsby migrants. And that's it for the migration strategies. I do want to point out that it wasn't all fairies and butterflies for us at Air. We did run into a few things I want to mention just in case you run into them on your journey. First and foremost, earlier we mentioned resolving issues with unsafe references to browser globals. If you find them inside third-party dependencies that you don't necessarily easily control, you can use Next dynamic to lazy load the component until after the window is available by leveraging Next dynamic with SSR set to false. Additionally, some libraries that we leveraged, like React D&D, required us to leverage Next transpile modules so that the dependencies themselves were retranspiled. Another issue we dealt with was mixing client routing with Next.js's router. In terms of going about the strategy that we did, the second strategy with a catch-all route, there are points in our application where Next pages navigate to the catch-all route, and the catch-all route navigates back to Next.js routes. As mentioned earlier, we leveraged window.open and normal anchor tags to resolve those issues because we were okay with a full browser reload, but you may want to come up with a solution for that yourself. Another issue we encountered is that our Redux store was defined globally as opposed to created via a method within the context of a React function. So we had to create a create store method and leverage it inside the catch-all route component. We also had a few circular dependency issues, and we resolved those by using a tool that we found on GitHub called Madge. The last issue that we ran into was needing to re-implement SVGR, which Create React app comes ready with out of the box. We really thought that this plugin right here worked out really well. We recommend that you use it as well. I wanted to thank everybody for giving me their focus and their attention, and thanks again to Vercel and Next.js for giving me the opportunity to share what we've learned from our migratory experience. I also wanted to thank everybody for being a part of what will probably be my only conference recording wearing sweatpants.